Welcome to the discussion. My guests today are Kirsten Billhart, the Global Marketing Director for the Edge Solutions Group at Dell Technologies, Zach Goldstein, the Chief Information Officer and the Director of High Performance Computing and Communications at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, Mac Townsend, the Technical Director for Architecture and Engineering in the CIO's Office in the Defense Intelligence Agency, and Lieutenant General Bruce Crawford, the Chief Information Officer, G6 for the U.S. Army. Welcome to the discussion. Let me set a little context for our conversation today. The future of computing is at the edge. That is becoming clearer every day. Whether it's soldiers in remote locations requiring data to make mission critical decisions, or sensors on the border or in the ocean, agencies are finding their networks extend almost indefinitely. IDC Government Insights says agencies collect more data than any other sector, and most of that data is now collected at the edge. IDC Government says agencies can leverage edge computing and artificial intelligence to make real-time decisions related to what that data shows. No surprise that IDC Government also predicts edge computing along with AI to be a high growth area for the next few years, especially with the expected implementation of 5G capabilities. To get that data to soldiers or employees in the field, agencies need a modern, flexible platform that mixes infrastructure and software to let them move workloads from the cloud to the data center to the edge with little trouble. Of course, edge computing comes with all those typical challenges of on-premise or even traditional cloud computing like security, latency, and legacy technologies that can't run in the cloud or in order to reach the edge. I think the end goal here, as DoD stated in its 2018 cloud computing strategy, is clear. Agencies must embrace computing solutions that enable warfighters, or really any employee, in their environment versus forcing them to conform to a current environment of siloed data and legacy applications. So with that context in place, let's turn to our panelists. Let me start with Lieutenant General Crawford. Edge computing, this is all about the warfighter. This is something that obviously the DoD, the military, the Army has been really focusing on for several years. How do you define edge computing within the Army?
First of all, Jason, thanks for having me. I think probably, so the way we defined the edge computing, I'd say 90 days ago, informed by the environment that we've been operating in recently, I think it's going to fundamentally change. I think the term edge is going to be the key component of that, because you could make the argument that the edge is a relative term. The edge is in the eyes of the beholder. And so I guess my fundamental thesis, and the thing that I'd like to anchor a lot of this conversation to, is we are literally, as we look at the Army, 1.4 million or so users, and that's soldiers and about 250,000 civilians. I think the fundamental premise here in my thesis is the edge is now wherever the user actually happens to be. Your office, your tactical operations center, et cetera, is wherever you happen to be. And so moving forward, when we think about this particular problem set and the definition of it, it's almost in the eyes of the beholder, and it's going to be informed by what we've been doing over the last 90 days. And I think if I identify kind of another salient point associated with where the edge is, and I know we'll get into a discussion about cybersecurity concerns, et cetera, but the dramatic expansion almost overnight of the attack surface that we're going to have to defend that's associated with the edge is going to be a key task for all of us. So that's how I define edge computing. It literally is wherever the user happens to be, and being able to access from any device, being able to access any data, be it from your personal device or from government furnished devices in any environment.
I want to do one quick follow-up, because I think it's very interesting that you are kind of re-looking at what the edge means to the Army, to the military more generally, just based on what we've dealt with the coronavirus pandemic. What made you kind of re-look at the edge? Because in many ways, you, as an example, worked in your office at the Pentagon, but you also potentially worked at a base in California or in Texas. So that was the edge then, and today you're just happen to be work in your home, or you may be working at the Pentagon or at that base in Texas.
Yeah, I think what drove my thinking, so I think you're aware that the DoD CIO actually stood up a COVID task force very early on, and hats off to Dana DC for pulling that team together. And that team didn't consist of just the CIOs. So it also included NSA, it also included Cybercom, and all the service cyber components as a part of that. And the aha moment for us was almost overnight when we went from probably about 1% teleworking, and I'll just use the Pentagon as an example, to about 90% teleworking. And so what drove my thinking is back to the expanded cyber attack surface discussion, is we went from having to defend and provide capability inside the traditional perimeter to having to defend and provide capability to the living room. And so as we look forward, rather than look backward, and I think Gartner got it right, okay, in terms of how they defined edge computing. But my premise, again, back to the thesis, is that when we talk about new normal and things that will endure, it's this big idea that we're literally gonna have to shift our thinking and think about the flexibility that we've got to put into our networks to defend and provide capability everywhere. Otherwise, we're going to sub-optimize on an old idea.
Zach, let me bring you into the discussion here because similar to General Crawford, NOAA is not the type of agency that does a lot of work maybe internally. You guys are at the edge quite often. How have you guys started to define edge computing, and is it different over the last 90 days?
It is different over the last 90 days for the same reasons that the General described. We have a lot of our workforce now working remotely, and as with any CIO, and you heard it in spades from the General, the first job of a CIO is to protect the mission while enabling and advancing the mission. And when we disperse our folks to places where they weren't used to working, immediately you're concerned, do they have the bandwidth to get the job done? Do we have the means to protect the ability to protect America with the systems that we operate for forecasting and disaster prediction? The good news is that we, for lots of reasons in terms of our move to the cloud, in terms of our planning for the possibility of pandemic response, we had the bandwidth for VPNs. We have the Google suite of applications that people can access from anywhere. And so from a bandwidth perspective, we're pretty well situated. We also had the ability to extend our boundary because telework is a very common thing in NOAA. The issue was the scale. So that's changed things. There were some issues where people had to access and administer systems, and we didn't have enough government managed equipment to do that, so we're rectifying that as quickly as possible. But I would like to expand on what the definition is. I agree, I really like the way General Crawford described it as wherever the user is. And it's a great starting point for us. We have our internal users, about 25,000 scientists, engineers, pilots, navigators, meteorologists, collaborators inside with NOAA credentials. But we also have the American people. NOAA touches everybody in this country every day. When you look at our space weather mission and our tsunami mission, it's actually a worldwide mission. And getting information to them in a secure manner quickly, so that it's a forecast and not what it could have been cast, is crucial. And the edge has a lot to do with it, and securing that edge such that the public information goes out unfettered, but bad guys can't come back inside and prevent us from issuing that information in the first place is a big challenge at the edge. And the other thing I would like to add, though, is everything in NOAA starts with an observation. We have many value chains, but they all start with an observation and end with actionable information. And that observation at the edge is massive. So we have satellites that either geostationary or polar orbiting or in solar synchronous orbit for space weather. And we're bringing down terabytes of data that we have to process and move, and in minutes turn an observation through multiple information systems into a forecast, which then has an edge itself. So, so to us, that's what the edge definition is. It's the observation all the way then out to the users who are doing things to the data, and then ultimately to the American people in the world on the other end of our value chain. It sounds daunting, but it's really exciting. There's some really exciting things that we're doing that I'd love to get into as this discussion progresses. But in your introduction, you talked about AI. We're using that to see how we can make more efficient use of bandwidth on our satellite observations. We're using the cloud at the edge, which is not a contradiction, to both handle the massive demands we get when we have a hurricane approaching the coast of the United States, and all of a sudden we're dealing with over 1 billion hits in 24 hours. We're using cloud to buffer that at the edge so we can keep our mission going. And we're using the cloud for the innovative citizen science initiatives we have to engage the best minds in the world to improve the models that we use to forecast the weather. And that is an initiative that sits at the edge.
All right, Zach, a lot there to dig out of, but we're going to jump over to Mac Townsend from DIA for a minute and talk a little bit about, for DIA, the edge also is very similar to what probably Lieutenant General Crawford said, but it also probably means a little different for you since you guys are in the intelligence world. Mac, jump in here and talk a little bit about how you guys define edge at DIA.
Will do, Jason. Hey, thanks very much for inviting us to participate in this austere forum. Really appreciate the opportunity, first of all. Secondarily, I think that General Crawford got into a lot of different things. The new normal is really the key as to what he's talking about with the COVID environment. We're in a similar situation where our forces went almost 70% overnight out into the unclassified environment, which is a different environment for us most of the time. We deal in classified and unclassified environments, and we have a worldwide presence that's associated with, at the highest levels of classification, about 250,000 users down to some of the lowest levels, which are the millions that Bruce was talking about as he was going forward. Bruce was talking about how access was important at the distant end, and it is. It's critical. I think that one of the things that we're looking at is not just that access, not just getting the capability down to the users at the distant end, our warfighters and other humanitarian aid and conflict mitigators, but it's also about the sensors. And to that end, I think that, Zach, the last point that Zach brought up was sort of, cloud at the edge for us, cloud in a box. Basically something where we can take a cloud in a box and put it out at the edge to help produce the type of intelligence and the information that we need to bring back. I think that the key there is that, both Bruce and Zach brought up the fact that there's a lot of data coming across, and the ability for us to make those observations, that information actionable as we're going forward is really the key component of what we're talking about. So edge is really about how we can triage that huge barrage of data that's coming in and funnel it down into the components that we need to be able to do our missions as we're going forward, and to understand the landscape of what's in the environment. And so that's where, that's again the tie-in that Zach mentioned with AI helps us do that. One of the things that we're looking at is how do you take this vast barrage of Internet of Things, of Army devices and sensors that are out there, of the NOAA weather kinds of capabilities, and how do you bring all that stuff together as we're going forward? Probably the best way that we're looking at that is approaching this from a thin data model. We want to know what something is, where it is, and when it is, so that then we can sort of drive down to a generalized view, a global view across all these various data sources. So I think that that's the most important piece as we're going forward from the from the edge data perspective, we have several different environments at the edge. We can't always afford to have a monstrous cloud at different places. And so one of the things that I wanted to talk about very briefly is that we have what's called a hybrid environment. And that's where we have, bare metal, we have virtual metal, we have cloud metal, things of this nature. And we have to make sure that the services that we provide can run on each of these different hardware platforms as we're going forward. And we're not just talking about a single cloud vendor. We look at all the cloud vendors out there. Obviously, Amazon and Azure are heavy in our environment today. We leverage other capabilities from cloud in the box. We leverage various different componentry from people like Dell and others that Kirsten, I imagine, will get into. But these are the types of things that we need to make sure that all our applications, all of our capabilities can run seamlessly on these things as we migrate out to the edge, and that we can associate that data. So I think that that's really where we're coming from in our environment. Does that help, Jason? Do you have any other questions?
It does, I do, but I'm going to bring in Kirsten instead and have her kind of comment on what we've heard from the three of you so far, because I think the redefining edge, I think is important, and I'd like for Kirsten to start there.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a pleasure to be here with all of you. There's a very common theme that ran through what everyone said, the Lieutenant General and Zach and Mac, which is the growing importance of having actionable intelligence for those frontline teams, wherever they may be, whether it is in a military environment or being able to have good weather information to prepare a community, really any kind of federal agency that's looking to do their work, having that near real-time actionable intelligence to give them a clear view of the ground truth of what the reality is, to be able to make good, strong decisions. And that, quote unquote edge looks a little bit different depending on what environment there is. So it's that relevancy argument that came up in the very beginning from Lieutenant General Crawford. From a technology perspective, at Dell Technologies, we see edge as bringing compute and all the other capabilities as close to the real-time environment as possible. And it's giving you the capability to rapidly analyze those data streams of information flowing through and converting that into actionable intelligence. So, from technical terms, it's reducing latency. It's reducing time lost because data has to, take a round trip to a cloud and back, or to a data center and back. Often that time, you just don't have that time to lose. Like, you want near instantaneous analysis of that fresh, relevant data in those milliseconds that it's most relevant, so that you can have the predictions and the analysis to those frontline teams so that they can make the right high quality, quick decisions that can lead to a more safe environment, a more efficient environment, and help progress the mission.
All right, there's a lot to dig out of there as well, but we're going to take a quick break. When we come back, that's what we're going to do. You're listening to the discussion, Edge Computing, Real-Time Insights that Deliver Real Results, sponsored by Dell Technologies on Federal News Network.